In 1624, John Donne published a book that contained a poem which is notable today for popularizing the phrase, "for whom the bell tolls." The poem begins, "No man is an island, entire of itself. Every man is a piece of the continent and a part of the main." The poem expresses a strong sentiment for the importance of communities, and how isolation and self-sufficiency, as an island entire of itself, is detrimental to humans. As it turned out, from both our own observations and those of ecologists everywhere, this may be as much of an astute observation for people as it is for all life. Ecopath with EcoSim is an open-source collection of ecosystem modeling tools with a focus on accounting for biomass and environment, and both how it is transferred throughout the ecosystem and to where. Interestingly enough, the product's tagline upon installation uses an adapted version of the quote from Don's poem, that is, "No fish is an island." In this context, it reveals a core ecological assertion that has shaped the program as it is today. That is, ecosystems involve a large, complex series of interactions, particularly trophic ones, on which all other interactions are dependent to some degree. One facet of this concept that we will be examining today is the idea of how carbon going into and coming out of an ecosystem in equilibrium is necessarily equal. I think there was this movie that had a song about that, something about a circle, I don't know. How does Ecopath help us with this problem specifically? Well, in this respect, the perspective it provides us has both benefits and disadvantages. The primary advantage it provides us, however, is allowing us to model each trophic level in a kind of matrix, which then allows us to quantify exactly how much of any given trophic level's diet is made up of the other trophic levels, and in what proportions. The data generated by these techniques is invaluable in environmental management. We'll be looking at two case study ecosystems, Smith's Lake and Yellowstone, and examine trends in their trophic dynamics, as well as the outcomes of imbalances in these systems. Smith's Lake, located on the coast of New South Wales between Newcastle and Port Macquarie, is an example of a relatively self-contained ecosystem, and is well suited to the kind of analysis provided by Ecopath. Because of the way that sand builds up on the beach adjacent to Smith's Lake, it is often sealed off from the ocean for about 18 months at a time, meaning that fish and the marine fauna in the estuary generally stay where they are. These environmental conditions allow us to make estimates about the population and trophic dynamics much more easily, as there is significantly less accounting that must be done to factor in migratory behavior, overlapping habitats, and so on. Ecopath allows us to simulate an ecosystem such as Smith's Lake by first gathering information on parameters for species compositions, diets, biomasses, and mortality consumption harvest rates. At the end of our analysis, we have information on the structure of the food web, what different trophic levels are present, how the ecosystem is balanced, and finally, some more practical information such as the maximum sustainable yield of a target species. The reason that modeling this ecosystem works so effectively is because it's relatively stable, with a comparatively small amount of biomass being removed from the system via the local sustainable fisheries and seabirds. However, the carbon it loses this way, it eventually gets back.
Seagulls always stay near land. They only go out to sea to die.
No, not like that. Smith's Lake is home to a number of photosynthetic organisms that are capable of fixing carbon from the atmosphere, including seagrasses, algae, phytoplankton, and even some jellyfish. During our time at Smith's Lake, we gathered a large amount of data from different parts of the ecosystem, and we were able to compare our findings with those from previous years. Let's take a look at what we found and how that fits into the analysis in Ecopath. With regards to biomass, we recorded various kinds of abundance data and size-weight relationship statistics for 15 unique groups present in the lake, including plankton, jellyfish, small and large fish, and even some seabirds. By comparing this with geographical data, we were able to estimate the biomass for each one of these groups per square meter in the lake. Then, using Ecopath equations, we are able to estimate the theoretical biomass per meter square that would be present in a stable, closed environment. The big fish were severely underrepresented in our measurements, which may have had something to do with either the fisheries operating in Smith's Lake, our sampling method, or perhaps something else entirely. The other kinds of fish as well were not especially close to their estimated values. Small fish, however, had a reasonably close measured and calculated biomass, which is a much better sign. These kinds of fish tend to be easier to catch, and therefore can be more accurately represented in data. Here's where we begin to run into problems though. The calculated biomass of plankton seems inordinately high. To more accurately represent this using the Ecopath matrix spreadsheet, we need to remove some data. A large part of their predation comes from jellyfish. However, as mentioned before, there are also autotrophic photosynthetic jellyfish that are counted in this figure, about 80% of all individuals in fact, but they only make up about 20% of the jellyfish biomass since most of them are tiny. If we multiply the measured biomass of jellyfish in Smith's Lake by 0.8 to only represent the carnivorous jellyfish, then our figure for calculated zooplankton biomass is lowered somewhat. This number, however, is still enormous. However, we can't expect our measured value to approach this number even slightly. There's so much predation of zooplankton by other groups of organisms that it's unfeasible to expect the full amount in our samples. Other reasons for this discrepancy are a result of consistent undersampling of zooplankton, which is a well-documented shortcoming of the techniques that we employed. As it stands, we don't really have a way to mitigate or compensate for this, so we just have to acknowledge it and move on. The raw results when compared with previous years was unhelpful, to say the least. The scale is much too high, and there are a few extreme outliers. By removing the 4 largest values, we get a much more legible graph. Additionally, this version has been reordered to reflect the trophic levels from highest to lowest, which we calculated using Ecopath, using the trophic matrix and the abundance data that was shown previously. This graph looks a little more like what we would expect in a theoretical model, but there are still an exorbitant amount of jellyfish, reflected across multiple years. One explanation for this is that the jellyfish in Smith's Lake are more tolerant of water with low levels of dissolved oxygen, and that Smith's Lake has a lower amount of dissolved oxygen on its surface than its adjacent marine environments. While only a hypothesis, it is something to keep in mind for future experimentation, as we know Smith's Lake's dissolved oxygen level is slightly lower than the oceanic surface average. With that said, if we leave aside jellyfish, we get a much more sensible looking graph. With the exception of epifauna and some outlying years across various groups, the curve generally reflects the idea that the ecosystem doesn't support a large amount of biomass from higher trophic groups, in that sort of upside-down logarithmic trend you would expect from this kind of data. To summarize, our data from Smith's Lake, when analysed through the lens of Ecopath, shows us the profile and the shape of this isolated underwater ecosystem. While its exact dimensions remain somewhat obscured, the type of data and its analysis is what's critical in maintaining the health of these kinds of ecosystems, especially those that are shared with and depended on by different communities of people. Ultimately, when sustainability is concerned, it is imperative to consider the impacts that removal of certain species will have. Removing too much carbon from an ecosystem, particularly from the top end of the trophic levels, can have extremely dire consequences, which brings us to our next example. Yellowstone National Park is a textbook example of how a slight change in the composition of an ecosystem that is unbalanced can have enormous, far-reaching impact across the environment as a whole. Towards the beginning of the 20th century, wolves were completely eradicated from the area, and without an apex predator in the ecosystem, there were a large number of imbalances in the structure of the ecosystem that grow into deleterious changes over time. Notably, the population of elk exploded, causing massive damage to grass, bushes, and shrubs in the area over time. By the 1990s, however, the way people considered the environment and its preservation had drastically shifted, and the decision was made by biologists and park management to reintroduce wolves to the ecosystem in 1995. In the next few years, the new wolves and their offspring had drastically reduced the number of elk, but also modified their behavior. By avoiding open areas where they could be more easily hunted, the elk gave these open areas that had been grazed flat the chance to grow at an astounding rate, increasing the number and size of trees and shrubs, which attracted songbirds, beavers, and other small mammals. Beavers contributed even further to habitat modification, as their industrious nature and their ability to create dams created a number of new microhabitats, which attracted new reptiles, small mammals, and even new fish. The attraction of small birds also increases the growth and the spread of seeded plants like berry bushes and fruited trees, and adapting the environment even further in the process. Introducing wolves also reduced the prevalence of mesopredators such as coyotes, which had the impact of increasing the number of small mammals such as rats and squirrels. This in turn attracted predatory birds such as hawks back to the park. Perhaps most astoundingly, over time the rivers began to flow more directly and meander less, as the increased growth of trees stabilized the banks and cut down on erosion. This is a textbook example of a trophic cascade, where the introduction of an apex predator to an ecosystem drastically reshapes it. As Yellowstone was an ecosystem that had been missing an apex predator that it originally developed with, their reintroduction was like unkinking a hose and then releasing built-up pressure. While Ecopath was designed with marine ecosystems in mind, the core ecological principles it's built on remain the same for many different kinds of environments with regards to sustainability. Without any brakes on population growth, some trophic groups can grow exponentially, absorbing a wildly disproportionate amount of biomass from lower trophic levels and potentially causing severe environmental damage. Our takeaway from these examples as ecologists and environmental advocates should be to exercise caution when making decisions that can have a broader impact on our environment, and to think about our actions not just as they relate to an individual animal or an individual species, but every organism that depends on their relationship with a plant, animal, or even non-living environmental feature in question, and beyond that, every organism that depends on all of those organisms. After all, as the old saying goes, no fish is an island. Thank you for your time.